At 11:01 a.m. on April 3, 2026, the Okanagan Springs fire was reported as a manageable 20-hectare spot fire on the dry eastern slopes of the Okanagan Valley. By 1:30 p.m., it had exploded to 600 hectares. By 4:30 p.m., it reached 1,400 hectares. In less than 6 hours, a wall of flame had consumed an area larger than the entire downtown core of Vancouver, moving with a ferocity that defies every historical model for early spring in British Columbia. This is not a slow burn scenario. It is happening in real time, and the data suggests the baseline for Canadian wildfire behavior has fundamentally fractured. Right now, what scientists at Natural Resources Canada and Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, saw in last week's snowpack data changes everything we thought we knew about the 2026 season. The sky above Penticton and the Skaha Estates neighborhood turned a bruised, apocalyptic brown before most residents even received an emergency alert. Frank Desjardins looked out his window in the Skaha Hills development and thought his neighbors' cedar-shaked roofs were already on fire. They weren't, not yet, but the flames were cresting the ridge, fueled by a 90 km/h wind tunnel effect screaming through the valley. This is the April shock, the realization that the buffer between the winter thaw and the summer heat has evaporated. By 7 p.m., the Okanagan Springs fire had scorched 1,690 hectares, roughly 4,176 acres, and was 0% contained. Evacuation orders were active for 12 zones across the regional district of Okanagan-Similkameen. At the same time, 150 kilometers to the northwest, a second ignition, the Nikola fire near Merritt, had already claimed another 140 hectares. Two catastrophic starts, two regions, one terrifying afternoon. The wind was the story the locals told, but the wind was merely the trigger. The true catalyst lay beneath the surface, in the desiccated organic layers of the soil, and the mountain range that had failed to keep its winter promise. 2 days before the first spark, hydrologists from the BC River Forecast Center drove to the Blackwall Peak snow pillar in Manning Park and pushed their measuring rods into what should have been a deep, protective mantle. The measurement was 18% of the historical average. In the northern Manashee Range, it was a staggering 6%. It was the worst snowpack recorded in British Columbia's modern history. Yet only 3 months earlier, in January 2026, the province had been declared technically drought-free for the first time in years due to heavy atmospheric river events. The disconnect is lethal. The rain fell, but it did not stay. It ran off into the Pacific, leaving the high-altitude fuels exposed to an early March heat dome that turned the province into a kiln. This is not just a story of two wind-driven fires. This is the story of a nation that called itself recovered, while the ground beneath its feet was preparing to burn in a month usually defined by mud and melt. At 11:01 a.m. on April 3, 2026, the first emergency call pinged the BC Wildfire Service dispatch in Kamloops. The Okanagan Springs fire was reported as a small plume near the intersection of Highway 97 and East Side Road. Initial assessments estimated the burn at roughly 20 hectares. But within minutes, the atmospheric conditions, a lethal combination of a high-pressure ridge over the Monashee Mountains and a deepening low-pressure system off the coast of Vancouver Island, began to force air through the Okanagan Valley's narrow corridors. This created a Venturi effect, compressing and accelerating northern winds to 90 km/h. By 1:30 p.m., the fire had breached the 600-hectare mark. An area larger than Stanley Park was consumed in 149 minutes. Seismographs and infrasound sensors maintained by Natural Resources Canada near Summerland actually registered the atmospheric shock waves from the fire's own internal weather system. As the fire entered the Box Canyon area, it transitioned from a surface burn to an active crown fire, releasing energy equivalent to several kilotons of TNT per hour. By 4:30 p.m., the perimeter encompassed 1,416 hectares. By 7 p.m., the total stood at 1,690 hectares. This rate of expansion, averaging 34 hectares per hour across a single afternoon, is statistically impossible for early April. April in the British Columbia interior is historically the buffer month, a period where the high elevation snowmelt keeps the valley floor's soil moisture levels near saturation, preventing the fine fuels like cheatgrass and ponderosa pine needles from reaching the ignition threshold. The 2026 data reveals a catastrophic failure of this natural braking system. Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, had tracked a record-breaking March heat dome that saw temperatures in Osoyoos hit 28 degrees Celsius 3 months ahead of schedule. This heat did more than just melt the snow, it vaporized it. The phenomenon, known as snow drought, occurs when winter precipitation falls as rain rather than accumulating as a frozen reservoir. While BC's reservoirs appeared full in January, the mountain peaks were bare. Without the slow, cold release of meltwater, the trans-Himalayan climate of the South Okanagan turned into a powder keg. By April 1st, NRCan's automated soil moisture probes at 3,000 feet showed levels at 12%, a figure usually not seen until mid-August. At 12:26 p.m., while crews were being overrun at Caledon, a second ignition occurred near Merritt along the Coquihalla Highway corridor. Dubbed the Nicola Fire, it exploited the same April gap. Within an hour, smoke from both fires merged into a massive drift advisory that choked the Highway 97 corridor from Kelowna to the US-Canada border. The British Columbia Wildfire Fund, a provincial reserve modeled after large-scale disaster recovery frameworks and bolstered to $21 billion following the catastrophic 2024 season, faced its first major test of 2026. This fund was heavily drawn upon during the Whistler skirmish fires of January 2025, an event that many hoped was a one-off anomaly. It wasn't. David Thorne, a senior wildfire analyst with the BC Wildfire Service, noted in a 2 p.m. briefing that the fire behavior indices are off the charts for this time of year. We are seeing flame lengths of 30 meters in April. We shouldn't be seeing this until the dog days of summer. The infrastructure vulnerability is extreme. The fires sit directly under the main 500 kilovolt BC Hydro transmission lines that feed the lower mainland. A flashover, where ionized smoke allows electricity to jump from the lines to the ground, could trigger a localized grid collapse. Already, Rogers and TELUS reported 3 cell tower sites in the Skaha region as offline due to thermal damage to fiber optic trunk lines. Maurice Williams, a rancher who has lived near the Caledon Hills for 2 decades, told local reporters he had never seen the sagebrush ignite with such explosive velocity. By late afternoon, 265 fighters, 36 engines, and 10 air tankers, including the massive Conair Dash-8s, were diverted from across the province to a single 20-kilometer stretch of the Okanagan. These are resources typically reserved for campaign fires in July. The logistical strain is compounded by the fact that many seasonal firefighters hadn't even finished their spring training modules. The system is being asked to perform at 100% capacity while still in its winter dormancy. The Caledon Springs fire isn't just an early start. It is a fundamental shift in the Canadian tectonic fire regime, where the geological lack of water storage in the mountains is now dictating the survival of the cities in the valleys. The precedent that maps most directly onto the April 2026 disaster is the catastrophic heat dome summer of 2021, but with a chilling inversion of the timeline. In June 2021, the village of Lytton, British Columbia, recorded a temperature of 49.6 degrees Celsius, the highest ever in Canada, before being erased from the map by a fire that moved faster than a person could run. That year, the statewide snowpack on April 1st had been at 59% of the historical average. It was low, but at the time it was not considered an immediate harbinger of total collapse. The subsequent fires, including the Sparks Lake and White Rock Lake blazes, consumed over 800,000 hectares, rewriting the provincial record books. But in 2026, the numbers are far more dire. The April 1st survey showed a snowpack of only 18%. This is the zero margin scenario. To understand why this is a geophysical crisis and not just a weather event, one must look at the coupled systems of the Canadian Cordillera. Snowpack in the coast and Monashi Mountains is not merely stored water for agriculture, it is stored fire suppression. It is a cryogenic thermal regulator. In a normal year, the slow transition of snow to meltwater through May, June, and July performs two critical functions. It keeps the soil moisture levels high, and it maintains a cool, humid microclimate in the valley bottoms. When that snow is absent, the thermal equilibrium of the entire region shifts. The dark granitic rock faces of the Okanagan Valley, geological remnants of massive tectonic uplift and glacial scouring, act as giant heat radiators. Without the cooling influence of high-altitude snowbanks, these rock walls absorb solar radiation at an accelerated rate, creating thermal chimneys that suck air upward and pull in violent, dry winds from the high plateaus of the interior. This is a geophysical wind tunnel. Dr. Elena Sokolov, a lead researcher at the Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, warns that the soil moisture depth created by the 2026 snow drought is irreversible. We are seeing a total decoupling of the hydrologic cycle, she stated in an NRCAN emergency briefing. The heavy rains we saw in January 2026 actually worsened the situation. In Canada's steep terrain, high-volume rain events on frozen ground lead to massive runoff and erosion, not infiltration. The water flowed into the Fraser and Thompson rivers and out to the Pacific. It didn't soak into the deep organic layers, the duff, of the forest floor. The result is a flash dry of the landscape. The vegetation above 1,000 meters, which usually holds moisture until late July, reached its critical tinder point by the third week of March. The statistics from the April 3rd Caledon Springs fire confirm the lethality of this cycle. The fire's rate of growth, 84 hectares per hour, is typically only seen in the boreal forests of northern Alberta during the peak of the beast, the 2016 Fort McMurray fire. To see this in a temperate valley in early April suggests that the fire season is no longer a season, but a permanent state of the Canadian landscape. There is a particular kind of false security that follows a wet winter. British Columbians saw the atmospheric rivers of December 2025 and January 2026 as a reprieve from the multi-year drought. But the data from the Pacific Geoscience Center tells a different story. While the surface looked wet, the deep moisture sensors, probes that measure the conductivity of the Earth at a depth of 2 meters, remained in the extreme deficit zone. The fire isn't just burning the trees, it is burning into the ground, consuming the ancient peat and root systems that hold the soil together. The twist in the 2026 data is the atmospheric squeeze. As the Arctic warms, the jet stream has become more wavy or meridional. This trapped a stagnant ultra-dry air mass over the Okanagan, just as the Caledon Springs fire ignited. This wasn't a random spark. It was a predictable outcome of a system where the geological water battery, the snowpack, failed to recharge. By 8 p.m. on April 3rd, the fire had achieved geography status. It was no longer an incident being managed, but a force of nature dictating the movement of thousands of people. The Caledon fire was 25% contained by nightfall, but that number is a dangerous illusion. The containment lines are thin strips of dirt against a landscape that is 82% drier than it should be. The season has 8 months left to run, and the reservoir of stored suppression is already empty. The sound of the Caledon Springs fire was not a crackle. It was a low-frequency roar, a geological resonance that friend Desjardins could feel in his sternum before he saw the first ember. From his deck in the Skaha Hills development, the fire looked like a physical wall of orange-black matter moving at 25 meters per second. He had 5 minutes. In the frantic rush to throw photo albums and go back into his truck, Frank noticed his neighbor's irrigation systems were running, a desperate automated attempt to saturate cedar hedges that were already functionally dead from the March heat dome. It was a futile gesture against a fire that was now creating its own localized hurricane. By 5:30 p.m., the British Columbia emergency map was a sea of red. Sergeant Luc Bouchard of the Penticton RCMP described the evacuation of the Skaha estates as controlled chaos. Highway 97, the primary artery through the valley, was choked with vehicles as the fire jumped the 2-lane blacktop near the provincial park. People were abandoning trailers, Bouchard noted in an after-action report. The heat was so intense it was melting the plastic cladding on the side of vehicles as they drove past the flank. This is the reality of the wildland-urban interface, WUI, in the 2020s. Moreno Valley had its parallels in the Okanagan's expansion. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, development pushed further into the ponderosa pines and bunchgrass of the hillsides, placing high-density, wood-framed housing directly into a natural fire corridor. The economic fallout is staggering. The British Columbia Wildfire Fund, the $21 billion provincial reserve, was designed to buffer the catastrophic liability of utilities and infrastructure failure. It had already been tapped during the O'Keefe Fire of January 2025 near Vernon, which burned 9,418 structures in a freak midwinter Santa Ana-style wind event. For those residents, the Springs fire isn't just another news cycle. It's a recurring nightmare. Thousands of families from the 2025 event are still living in temporary modular housing or with relatives in Kelowna. Rebuilding permits have slowed to a crawl as insurance companies reassess the entire viability of the Okanagan's fire zones. Jack Buckley, a risk analyst at a Vancouver-based energy consultancy, warned that the fund's current balance is a closely guarded provincial secret. We are in a position where every 14 to 18 months we are looking for another 5 to 10 billion Canadian dollars to stabilize the insurance market, Buckley stated. The system was built for once-in-a-generation events. We are now seeing once-in-a-generation every spring. The structural losses from the Caledon Springs fire alone are projected to exceed 1.8 billion Canadian dollars, with over 150 homes confirmed destroyed within the first 4 hours of the fire's run. In the command center, Anika Varma, an incident commander with the BC Wildfire Service, watched the satellite feeds in disbelief. We pulled 10 air tankers from winter maintenance rotations. These planes weren't supposed to be in the air until late May, she said. The logistics of a 1,600-hectare fire in early April are a nightmare. Most of the provincial Type 1 fire crews were still in the middle of their fitness certifications. Seasonal contracts hadn't fully kicked in. The firefighting response was a patchwork of local municipal departments and skeleton provincial crews, fighting a fire with the energy output of a mid-August crown fire. The ecological damage is equally profound. When a fire of this intensity burns through soil with zero moisture, it triggers a process called vitrification, or the creation of a hydrophobic layer. The extreme heat causes organic compounds in the soil to gasify and then solidify as a waxy coating on the soil particles. This means that when the rains finally do come, the ground will act like concrete. The water will not soak in, it will sheet off the hillsides, creating massive debris flows and landslides that threaten to bury the very highways and rail lines being fought for today. By 10 p.m., the smoke plume had reached an altitude of 10,000 meters, seeding pyrocumulonimbus clouds that generated dry lightning, sparking 2 more spot fires near Summerland. The families sitting in the evacuation centers in Oliver and Osoyoos are facing a grim calculus. If the fire can move this fast in April, what happens in July when the temperature hits 40 degrees Celsius? The Caledon Springs fire has proven that the seasonal nature of Canadian disasters is dead. The clock is ticking, not toward a summer fire season, but toward a year-round state of geological and atmospheric siege. The 25% containment of the Caledon Springs fire is a mathematical victory, but a geophysical illusion. As the sun sets on April 3, 2026, the thermal sensors on the Sentinel-2 satellite show heat signatures that have already penetrated deep into the organic duff of the Okanagan Hills. This is the subsurface depth. Even if the visible flames are extinguished, the heat remains in the root systems and the desiccated pit. In the current 18% snowpack reality, there is no hydrologic pressure to push that heat back out. The moisture that usually filters down from the mountain peaks to keep the valleys humid is simply not there. This sets the stage for zombie fires, blazes that will smolder underground for months only to resurface in June when the mercury hits 35 degrees Celsius, effectively bypassing all suppression efforts. The risk is no longer localized to the interior. The coupled system of the Canadian Cordillera means that the failure of the mountain snowpack cascades across the entire Western economy. By 2027 and 2028, we are looking at a permanent shift in the fire return interval. Forests on Vancouver Island, once considered wet and fire-resistant, are now showing the same vitrified soil markers as the Okanagan. The Geological Survey of Canada has tracked a 14-centimeter subsidence in the Fraser Valley's water table over the last 18 months. This is not just a drought, it is a structural change in how the Canadian landmass stores water. The vulnerability of the national infrastructure cannot be overstated. The Caledon Springs fire sits at the throat of Canada's western logistics. If a similar fire hits the Fraser Canyon or the Rogers Pass later this season, the Trans-Canada Highway and the primary rail corridors for CPKC and CN will be severed. These are the arteries that feed the port of Vancouver, Canada's largest port and a $300 billion annual economic engine. A single wind-driven April shock fire in a strategic corridor can decouple the prairies from the Pacific in a matter of hours. This isn't a hypothetical model. The 2021 Lytton disaster proved that a 20-minute fire can cause a multi-billion-dollar logistics collapse. In 2026, we are facing that same threat, but the buffer of the spring melt has been deleted from the equation. The data from the National Interagency Coordination Center in Winnipeg suggests that the fire weather envelope is expanding north into the permafrost zones of the Yukon and Northwest Territories. As the permafrost thaws, it releases methane, but it also loses its structural integrity. We are seeing geological fire coupling, where intense wildfires burn off the protective moss layer of the permafrost, causing rapid thaw, massive landslides, and the release of sequestered carbon that further accelerates the local heat dome effect. It is a self-reinforcing feedback loop that Canadian emergency services were never designed to manage. Public Safety Canada's internal risk assessments, leaked in early March, suggest that the cost of climate-driven interruption to the Canadian economy could reach 100 billion Canadian dollars annually by the end of the decade. The British Columbia Wildfire Fund, currently an undisclosed amount, is a finger in a dike that is fundamentally failing. When the Eaton Fire of 2025 and the Caledon Springs Fire of 2026 are separated by only 14 months of high-stress recovery, the window for rebuilding is closing. We are entering an era of permanent evacuation, where the costs to ensure and protect wildland-urban interface communities like those in the Okanagan or the Alberta foothills, become mathematically impossible for the private sector to bear. The Springs fire is a warning shot from a system that is no longer in equilibrium. The San Gorgonio-style wind tunnels of the BC interior are accelerating. The mountain water battery is at 18% capacity, and the vegetation is drier than it has been in a century. The firefighters on the line tonight are battling modern flames. They are battling a shifting geography. April 3rd confirmed the math with smoke. The snowpack gave us the number. The fire gave us the address. The fire season didn't start today. It simply never ended. This is the new baseline for the Canadian landscape. The inevitability of the next spark is written into the moisture charts and the GNSS ground inflation data. We are no longer waiting for the disaster. We are living inside its expansion phase. If you want to understand the data before the smoke